I stood before my drafting table, the crisp lines of the Helix Tower blueprints illuminated by the morning light filtering through the glass walls of the penthouse office. Today was my 18th birthday, but there were no balloons, no cake, no warm wishes. Just the hum of the server and the scratching of Joseph's pen as he signed documents at his mahogany desk. He walked over, not looking at me but at the blueprints. My blueprints. With a sneer that twisted his features into something unrecognizable, he tossed a single crisp $100 bill onto the table. It landed softly, covering the intricate structural calculations I had agonized over for weeks. "Happy birthday, Grace," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "Take it. I'm done feeding a stray cat. Pack your things. You're fired." He leaned in close, the scent of expensive cologne cloying in the air. "You're a talentless burden just like your mother. I'm trimming the fat." He turned his back on me, dismissing me like I was nothing more than a clerical error he had finally corrected. But as I looked at that bill sitting on top of my designs, the very designs he intended to steal to save his failing career, something cold and hard settled in my chest. Before we see how Grace tears his empire down, drop a comment. Where are you watching from and what time is it in your corner of the world? I love seeing our community light up the map. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. The office smelled of expensive espresso and betrayal, a scent I had grown accustomed to over the years. I picked up the $100 bill not out of greed but as evidence. It felt heavy in my hand, a tangible representation of his arrogance. I moved methodically, packing my singular belongings. My drafting pencils worn down to nubs from endless nights of work, and my hard drive, the digital vault of my intellectual property. Joseph watched me from his desk, a smug smile playing on his lips, assuming my silence was submission. He thought he had crushed me, but he was wrong. As I placed the items into my bag, my mind was already racing, cataloging the metadata on my private server. Every file, every timestamp, every revision history. It was all there, irrefutable proof that the Helix Tower was mine. He could steal the paper, but he couldn't steal the digital footprint. I zipped up my bag, the sound loud in the quiet office. I walked to the door, my steps steady on the polished floor. I didn't look back. I walked out into the cold Chicago wind, the city rising around me like a fortress of glass and steel. I wasn't a victim leaving the scene of a crime. I was a strategist leaving the battlefield to regroup. The transition to my new reality was swift. My apartment was small and dim, a stark contrast to the penthouse office, but it was mine. I looked at my reflection in the cracked bathroom mirror. The girl staring back at me looked tired, but her eyes were clear. For years I had lived in a prison of gratitude, a structure Joseph had built brick by gaslighting brick. He had convinced me that my talent was nothing without his guidance, that my vision was flawed without his correction. "You have no eye for structure," he would say, while simultaneously demanding I fix his sketches until 3 in the morning. It wasn't just about money or a job. It was psychological warfare. He had created a reality where I was dependent on him for my very sense of self-worth. I had believed him. I had believed that I was lucky to be there, lucky to be learning from him, even as he took credit for every line I drew. It was a learned helplessness, a conditioning so deep it felt like instinct. But as I stood there in the silence of my own space, the fog began to lift. I realized that the chains binding me to him weren't made of iron. They were made of lies. I wasn't weak. I was strong enough to survive him, and now I was strong enough to destroy him. Weeks turned into a blur of news cycles and industry gossip. Joseph was everywhere. He had won the bid for the massive Helix Tower project, and the architectural world was fawning over him. He gave interviews, his face plastered on magazine covers, claiming the vision had come to him in a dream. A dream. It was my reality he was stealing. My phone buzzed with a text from him. "See? Real architects win. You were just a tracer. Don't bother using me as a reference." His arrogance was boundless. He truly believed I was too poor, too young, and too broken to fight back. He thought he had erased me. But every time I saw his face on a screen, every time I read his quotes about innovation and vision, the fire in my belly grew hotter. He wasn't just a thief. He was a parasite, feeding off my talent to sustain his crumbling ego. And like any parasite, he needed a host. Without me, he was nothing. I stopped grieving the father figure I never really had. Grief was a luxury I couldn't afford. I went to the public library, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like a swarm of angry bees. I accessed the cloud server I had secretly maintained, the one Joseph didn't know existed. I began to compile a digital portfolio, timestamped sketches, early drafts, notes on structural integrity. And then the piece de resistance. The specific structural flaw I had intentionally left in the decoy files on Joseph's computer. A flaw so subtle only the original architect would know how to fix it. I wasn't looking for a lawyer. Lawyers were slow, expensive, and could be bought. I was looking for something more powerful. I was looking for the client. The entity commissioning the Helix Tower. The one with the money and the power to end Joseph's charade with a single phone call. I scoured public records, construction permits, and industry whispers. Finally, I found a name. Edward. An infrastructure mogul known for being elusive. A ghost in the machine of Chicago's development scene. I drafted a single encrypted email to his private firm. The subject line was simple, precise, and terrifying to anyone who understood architecture. The load-bearing calculation on the 40th floor is wrong. Here is the correction. I attached the proof of my authorship, the digital breadcrumbs that led straight back to me. I hit send and waited. The response was immediate, flashing across my screen like a lightning bolt. Come to my office. Now. I walked into Edward's office, the space imposing and sleek, a testament to his power. He sat behind a desk that looked more like a command center than furniture. He didn't offer me a seat. He just held up my drawings, his eyes scanning them with an intensity that made me want to flinch. But I didn't. I stood my ground. He began to drill me on architectural theory, throwing complex questions at me about load distribution, wind shear, and material stress. I answered every single one. Flawlessly. I didn't just know the answers, I felt them. Architecture wasn't just math to me, it was a language and I was fluent. Edward finally set the papers down. He looked at me, really looked at me for the first time. I didn't take this meeting because of the structural flaw, he said, his voice low. I took it because the style of this drawing, it reminded me of someone. Someone from my past. He opened a drawer and pulled out a photo. It was old, the edges worn. A woman stood in front of a building, smiling. My mother. My breath hitched. Your mother, Edward said. She had the same eye. The same way of seeing the world. He wasn't just the client. He was my biological father. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. All these years I had been told my father was dead, a man who didn't want me. Edward explained the truth. He had been told the baby was lost, that my mother had moved on. He had hired Joseph's firm because he wanted to support the man who raised me, believing Joseph was a decent man stepping up. He had been paying Joseph consulting fees for years. Money meant for my education, for my future. Money I never saw. It wasn't just plagiarism, it was fraud. It was embezzlement. It was a betrayal so profound it made my knees weak. Edward wanted to sue immediately. He wanted to drag Joseph into court and destroy him. But I shook my head. No, I said. Not yet. He wants the spotlight. Let's give it to him. But let's make sure it burns him. We plotted the ambush for the upcoming Skyline Design Awards Gala. The night Joseph was set to receive the contract publicly. It wouldn't be a reunion. It would be an execution. The Skyline Design Awards Gala was a spectacle of glass, light, and ego. The ballroom of the Ritz-Carlton buzzed with the hum of 1,000 conversations, the clink of crystal and the rustle of silk. It was the kind of room Joseph lived for, the kind of room he believed he owned. I watched him from the shadows near the entrance, my heart beating a steady war drum rhythm against my ribs. He stood near the center of the room, holding a champagne flute like a scepter, preening as colleagues congratulated him on the Helix Tower contract. He looked every inch the visionary architect he pretended to be, tuxedo perfectly tailored, smile practiced, confidence radiating off him like heat. But I knew the truth. It wasn't confidence, it was a costume. I stepped into the light. Edward had funded my attire for the evening. A sharp architectural black jumpsuit that commanded attention without begging for it. I walked toward Joseph, my steps silent on the plush carpet. He spotted me when I was 10 feet away. His smile faltered, then vanished, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated panic. He excused himself from his admirers and intercepted me, grabbing my arm with a grip that was meant to hurt. I told you to stay away, he hissed, his voice low and venomous. What are you doing here? You look cheap. I look like the architect of the building you're about to accept an award for, I replied, my voice calm. I pulled my arm free. And you look nervous, Joseph. He fumbled in his pocket, his movements jerky. He pulled out a money clip and peeled off several bills, hundreds this time. Take it, he said, thrusting the cash at me. Take it and get out. Make a scene and I will ruin you. I made you, Grace. I can unmake you. I looked at the money in his hand. It was pathetic. It was his only move, his only language. Keep it, I said, stepping around him. You're going to need it for legal fees. I left him standing there, mouth agape, and took my seat at the front table next to Edward. The lights dimmed. The room hushed. Joseph scrambled to his seat across the aisle, shooting daggers at me, sweating through his expensive suit. Edward took the stage. He didn't need a microphone to command the room. His presence was enough. Architecture is the art of truth, he began, his voice resonating through the hall. It reveals the structure of our world. But sometimes structures are built on lies. Innovation is rare. Theft is common. Joseph stiffened. He buttoned his jacket, preparing to stand, assuming this was the preamble to his coronation. Tonight, we honor the design for the Helix Tower, Edward continued. A design so unique, so mathematically precise, it could only come from one mind. He clicked a remote. The massive screen behind him lit up. It wasn't a render of the building. It was a blueprint. My blueprint. The original scan from my sketchbook, dated 3 years ago. And then an overlay appeared. The metadata from my cloud server highlighting the creation date, the revision history, the author, Grace_Arch_01. The winner of the contract, Edward said, his eyes locking onto Joseph, is the architect who actually drew this. The architect whose college fund was stolen to prop up a failing firm. Please welcome my daughter and the lead architect of the Helix project, Grace. The room gasped. It was a collective intake of breath that sucked the air out of the ballroom. Joseph froze, half standing, caught in a posture of awkward anticipation that instantly curdled into humiliation. I stood up. I didn't look at the crowd. I looked at Joseph. And then he snapped. It wasn't a slow burn. It was an explosion. Joseph rushed the stage, his face purple, veins bulging in his neck. She's incompetent, he screamed, his voice cracking. She's a charity case. I taught her everything she knows. I own her. He waved his arms, the expensive watch on his wrist flashing under the stage lights, a symbol of wealth he hadn't earned. I am the visionary here. Me. Look at my suit. Look at who I am. Security guards intercepted him before he could reach Edward, holding him back as he thrashed and spat. The crowd watched in horrified fascination. It was a masterclass in the psychology of the imposter. You see, Joseph's rage wasn't strength. It was the panic of a man whose identity was entirely purchased. He believed that if he had the right things, the office, the awards, the money, he was somebody. But deep down he knew the truth. He was a hollow shell. His status was a coat of paint over a crumbling foundation. When you strip away the stolen credit and the embezzled funds, there is no Joseph the architect. There is only a frightened, mediocre man terrified of being seen. His meltdown wasn't just a tantrum. It was the illusion of power shattering against the hard surface of reality. He thought his wallet gave him authority. But tonight, in front of the entire city, he learned that you can rent a lifestyle but you cannot buy a legacy. They dragged him out, still screaming about his importance. I walked up the stairs to the podium. Edward stepped aside, beaming with a pride that felt like the sun. I looked out at the sea of faces, at the industry titans who had ignored me for years. I didn't need to scream. I didn't need to fight. The blueprints behind me spoke for themselves. The aftermath was swift and absolute. The legal system does not look kindly on trustees who embezzle from minors, especially when the evidence is presented by a billionaire with a grudge. Joseph was charged with fraud and grand larceny. His firm was dissolved within the week, his partners fleeing like rats from a sinking ship. His reputation wasn't just tarnished, it was incinerated. We saw him in the news occasionally, a haggard figure entering the courthouse, alone. I imagined him sitting in a small cell or a cheap motel room, perhaps looking at that same $100 bill he tried to bribe me with, realizing it was the only thing he had left. I didn't visit him. I didn't need closure from him. I had built my own closure. 6 months later I stood in my new office. It wasn't a glass penthouse in the Gold Coast. It was a converted loft in the River North District, brick and timber, filled with light and the energy of creation. I wasn't working for Edward. We were partners. My name was on the door right next to his. I was designing the Helix Tower, overseeing construction, making decisions that reshaped the skyline I loved. There was a knock on my door frame. It was Aaron, my new intern. He was young, nervous, clutching a sketchbook like a shield. He reminded me so much of myself at 16. I finished the drafts you asked for, he stammered. But they're probably not good enough. I walked over to him. I didn't take the drawings and dismiss him. I sat down next to him. Let's look at them together, I said. Your eye for structure is good. You just need to trust your line. I saw his shoulders relax, a weight lifting off him. I was breaking the cycle. I was building a firm where talent was nurtured, not stolen. I walked to the window and looked out at the city. The steel and glass rose up to meet the sky, a testament to human will. I belonged here. I wasn't a tracer. I wasn't a burden. I was an architect. If you are watching this and you feel like you are living in the shadows of someone else's ego, if you are doing the work while someone else takes the bow, listen to me. You are not their prop. You are not their background character. They want you to believe that you are nothing without them because they know deep down they are nothing without you. Break the glass. Take your blueprints. Walk out the door. It will be cold and it will be scary, but I promise you the air is cleaner on the other side. You are the architect of your own life. Do not let anyone else hold the pen.
The email came on a Wednesday. The subject line was harmless enough. Quick update, free Christmas dinner, but I knew before I opened it. It was from my sister-in-law, Jessa. 5 lines, no greeting, no warmth. Hey, Celeste, this year's Christmas dinner is going to be a little tight space-wise. Hope you understand. Let's find another time to catch up after the holidays. Wishing you a peaceful season. I read it twice, not because it surprised me, but because it didn't. There was no phone call, no explanation. Just another polite erasure wrapped in seasonal language and signed off with indifference. I didn't reply. I didn't forward it to anyone or mention it in our family group thread, though I noticed later that my name had quietly vanished from the "What's everyone bringing" list. I closed the email and leaned back in my chair. Outside my apartment window, the city moved as if nothing had happened. Cars hummed past below, and someone across the street had already put up blinking lights. The coffee on my desk had gone cold. On the shelf behind me sat a small red box, one I hadn't touched in years. I reached for it without thinking, lifted the lid. Inside was a folded card, Christmas 27, one of the only handwritten notes I'd ever received from my father. Keep your head down, Celeste. Quiet. Girls last longer. He meant it as encouragement, I think. I was 16 then, and they still talked to me. I still had a place at the table. That was before I learned that silence makes people forget you. They forgot who paid the deposit on Mason's first office. They forgot who picked up Grandma when no one else would drive. They forgot I existed unless they needed something easy and visible or quiet. But this time, this year, they made a mistake. Because while they were deciding who was important enough to invite, they didn't know I had just finalized the acquisition of the logistics company they'd been courting for the last 11 months, the one they were planning to pitch on December 21st, the one whose future depended on a single name. Mine, and I was done being quiet. I've always known how my family sees me, not with malice exactly, just distance. Like I was a reliable background detail, someone you count on to refill the coffee or take the photo, someone you'd ever feature in the frame. My older brother Mason, on the other hand, was the centerpiece. He was always full of energy, the kind of person who took up space without asking for it. Loud, laugh, firm handshake, firm opinions. My parents used to call him a natural leader. I once heard my mother say he could sell rain to Seattle. They never said things like that about me. With me, it was always Celeste. Doesn't mind. Celeste will understand. She's always been more private. Learned young that being quiet made things easier for everyone. When Mason wanted to borrow my car, I handed over the keys. When my dad needed someone to organize the family's tax folders, I did it without being asked. I never made a fuss about it. That's how I got through dinners where no one asked about my job or holidays where I arrived on time and left with the dishes. They didn't ignore me out of cruelty. They ignored me because I didn't ask them not to. At my niece's birthday last year, I gave her a telescope and a book about constellations. Mason gave her a glittery scooter. Everyone clapped for the scooter. The telescope stayed in its box. My mom thanked me, but she couldn't remember what I'd brought 10 minutes later. It's not that I wanted applause. I just wanted to be seen. When I got promoted 2 years ago, my name printed on a real office door, I told my family over dinner at my parents' place. Mason didn't even pause between bites. "That's great, Celeste," he said, reaching for the butter. "By the way, Dad did. I tell you about the guy I met at the conference last week. That's how it always went." When I funded the deposit for Mason's second warehouse after his investor backed out, he forgot to mention it in his thank you speech. When I paid the final balance on Mom's knee surgery after the insurance gap, she told people her coverage finally kicked in. I didn't correct them. I told myself I didn't need credit. that what mattered was helping, being useful, staying dependable. But somewhere along the way, being dependable became being disposable. They didn't forget my name, they just stopped using it. Even when I was there, I wasn't really there. And now that I had something they wanted, they didn't even pretend Jess's email wasn't about space. It was a reminder you're not part of this. Not in the way that matters, but that was fine because I wasn't planning to stay in the background much longer. I never set out to build anything big. It started with a quiet exit, leaving a company I'd helped grow for 7 years after they passed me over for a promotion. I trained the recipient to handle. I didn't shout or threaten to quit. I just packed up my office one Friday afternoon and told no one. The next Monday, I sat at my kitchen table. With a second-hand laptop, a fresh legal pad, and a cheap cup of coffee, I gave myself a deadline. 90 days to find a problem worth solving. By day, I freelanced supply chain modeling. Mostly, I worked odd hours, took on clients no one wanted. By night, I researched the gaps between mid-sized distributors and emerging regional carriers. What I found wasn't flashy, but it was consistent. Eventually, I formed a company, Small Quiet Lean. I didn't name it after myself. I registered it in Delaware under a generic holding name. North Arrow Systems, no LinkedIn post, no family announcement. At first, it was just me and a 24-year-old operations genius named Malik, who I met through a Slack channel. Then came Julia, who handled contracts like a surgeon. Then Lena and I had been friends in college. We used to sit on the fire escape outside our dorm and talk about the kind of women we'd become. She was bold, irreverent, magnetic. I was the one who double-checked the train schedule, Lena had once said. If you ever need me to walk into a room and make everyone underestimate me, I'm your girl. I remembered that line when we were preparing our first major pitch. I wasn't trying to hide who I was, but I also knew after years of watching how people dismissed me that sometimes silence is the strongest leverage. Let them think the girl who never interrupted anyone wasn't capable of owning the room. Let them forget I was there until it was too late. That's how we built it. In just over a year, we'd acquired 3 smaller logistics firms, quietly, no fanfare. Our network ran leaner, faster, smarter. We turned down VC funding twice. I wanted control, not congratulations. So when Lena came to me with a file marked Prospective Strategic Partnership Eastbound Freight into Solutions, I almost laughed because Eastbound was my brother Mason's company, and the firm they wanted to partner with the company they believed would solve their distribution. Bottleneck was us. They had no idea I flipped through their pitch deck. It was all there, glowing projections, warehouse expansion timelines, expected reach into secondary markets. They'd clearly been working on this deal for months, and they didn't know the final decision rested with me. They thought I was still freelancing, still working from home. Still Celeste, the sister who never had much going on. That was the part that stung, how easy it had been for them to believe I'd stayed small, that I wouldn't build anything worth noticing. But I had. And now, every update, every email, every pre-contract draft flowed through Lena to my desk. There was one line Mason had written in the executive summary of his proposal that stayed with me. This partnership will allow both companies to scale quickly, provided the decision-makers remain aligned. It made me smile because I was the decision-maker, and I was about to give them the meeting they'd been begging for. They just wouldn't recognize it when it started. The meeting was scheduled for a Thursday morning, 9 Huzri a.m. sharp. Lena texted me at 8:46. They're early. Nervous. The cousins pacing. I watched the feed from my office well, technically a converted second bedroom in my apartment. The camera was tucked discreetly into the corner of the boardroom, wide-angle clear audio. Just enough to see their faces, not enough for them to know they were being seen. Mason arrived in a navy blazer, the one he wears when he wants to feel in control. Jonah, our cousin, followed behind him, carrying a branded portfolio like he was auditioning for a role. A third man, someone from their marketing team, said something about projections and locking this in before the holidays. Lena welcomed them with a calm smile. She wore gray, always gray, soft-spoken, but never unsure. She let them settle, let them talk. Mason, true to form, launched into the pitch before anyone asked. We believe this partnership is the missing piece. Your network, our routes, With the right execution, we're looking at doubling Q2 revenue by March. Lena nodded, jotting notes. Then she asked gently, "And what makes you confident we're aligned? We've done our research," Mason said. "We've modeled logistics based on your existing hubs. Assuming you're authorized to sign by Echelon Holdings, of course." There was a beat of silence. Lena leaned back in her chair. "I represent Echelon, but I don't sign." Mason blinked. "You're not the founder." "No," she said, and this time her voice carried more weight. "She is. She built the network. She funds it. She signs every deal." The air in the room shifted. Jonah leaned forward. "Wait, we've been speaking with the wrong person." Lena reached into her folio and slid a document across the table. I'd seen it earlier that week, my name in black ink, crisp and unmistakable. Celeste Ward, founder and CEO. Mason stared at the page, his eyes scanning it too quickly, as if speed would undo the meaning. "Is this a joke?" he asked quietly. "No," Lena said. "She got your Christmas message, by the way, the one about space being tight. Thought you'd want to know no one spoke." Jonah rubbed the back of his neck, suddenly very still. Mason looked like he wanted to speak, but couldn't find the right tone. Lena smiled, professional as ever. "You're still welcome to present your offer, but just so you know, she's not looking for partners anymore. She's looking to acquire." It was the gentlest knife I'd ever seen turned. I sat back from the monitor, letting the silence linger. They weren't angry yet. That would come later. Right now, they were just realizing all this time they thought I was sitting alone at Christmas because I had nowhere better to be. What they didn't know was that I'd been building the table they were now begging to sit at. I sent the email that same afternoon. No subject line, no greeting. Just one sentence. December 25th, 9 a.m., my address. Bring nothing. I knew they wouldn't respond. I also knew they would show up. When people realize they've been left out of something they thought they controlled, they don't demand an apology. They look for a way back in. So I waited. Christmas morning arrived cold and gray. The street was quiet, the city slowed to a crawl. I brewed coffee, lit a single candle on the windowsill, and set the table. 4 plates, 4 cups, linen napkins folded sharp at the corners. There was no centerpiece. Just warm bread eggs and a silver carafe that hadn't been used in years. At exactly 9 a.m., a knock opened the door to find Mason, Jonah, and our father. No wives, no kids, no coats, unzipped. Just the 3 of them standing on the porch like students waiting outside the principal's office. I didn't say a word, just stepped aside. They entered slowly, their footsteps too loud on the hardwood. Mason looked around. "You've kept it nice." I didn't answer. They sat hesitantly, each man glancing at the other as if waiting for permission. I poured coffee for everyone, including myself. Then I sat across from them and folded my hands. The silence stretched. Finally, Jonah cleared his throat. "So, are we here about the deal?" I looked at him, then at Mason, then at my father. "You're here because you remembered I exist," I said calmly. "And because you realized I'm not as invisible as you believed." Mason leaned forward. "Celeste, we didn't mean to..." What I interrupted. Didn't mean to leave my name off the invitation list. Didn't mean to send a 5-line email instead of a phone call. Or didn't mean to underestimate me for the 15th year in a row. No one answered. I reached for a folder resting on the edge of the table and slid it forward. Inside was the finalized contract. Everything they'd hoped for. The deal. The opportunity. The thing they'd built their projections around. Mason looked at it, then at me. Are you giving us the contract?" I nodded slowly. "Yes." "But there's a condition." He tensed. "What kind of condition?" "From this point forward, I said you work under my structure, not beside it. You report to me. You follow the systems I've built. And if I ever hear you speak to someone the way you spoke to me last month or last year or every year before that..." I let the pause stretch until Jonah shifted in his seat. "I won't cancel your deal," I finished. "I'll cut your company." The silence that followed was colder than the air outside. They knew I meant it. Not because I raised my voice, but because I didn't need to. Mason sat back, his jaw tight. Then finally he said something I hadn't expected. "You really waited for this moment." I looked at him. Really looked. "No," I said quietly. I waited for the silence to mean something, and then I stood. I picked up the empty plates. I refilled the carafe. I moved through the room like I had for years, but now they saw it. They saw me, not the helper, not the girl in the background, not the sibling who didn't mind, just me. And for the first time in a very long time, they had no idea what to do with that. I never stepped foot in their office, not once I didn't need to. The new logo, North Arrow Holdings, was mounted on the front of the building by the end of January. The font was sharp, understated. My name wasn't anywhere on it, but everyone inside knew who it pointed back to. The weekly reports started arriving like clockwork, polished decks, revised projections, revised tone. Mason's signature appeared smaller on each file, like he was shrinking into the margins. He was no longer CEO. That title went to someone else, a woman named Clarice, their former regional manager years ago. Mason once called her too soft to lead. Turns out she wasn't. Now she sat in the corner office, the one he used to fill with trophies and meaningless framed quotes. The plaques came down. The ego left with them. My cousin Jonah tried calling me twice. I didn't answer. Instead, I forwarded his number to our internal HR platform with a note. All communication goes through channels now. Keep it professional. He didn't try again. I wasn't angry anymore. Not exactly. Anger burns fast. What I felt was quieter than that, heavier, like ash after the fire's gone out. 3 weeks later, I walked past a coffee shop on my way to a meeting. Through the fogged glass, I saw them, Mason, Jonah, and my father. No smiles, no bluster, just 3 men staring into half-empty mugs, saying nothing. I didn't go in. Some reckonings are loud. Mine wasn't mine came in quarterly reports, system audits and controlled ownership transitions, clean, quiet, permanent. 30 days after the acquisition, the final paperwork was signed. Eastbound Freight and Solutions ceased to exist. The brand dissolved. Their email addresses were updated to @NorthArrowCom. Their legacy, once printed on business cards and splashed across banners at trade expos, now sat as a footnote in an internal document labeled Subsidiary Ward Group, Logistics Division. No announcement, no farewell post, just deletion. A week after that, I called an all-hands meeting. I didn't tell them I'd be attending. They packed into the conference room like it was any other quarterly update. Mason sat in the front row spine, straight. Clarice stood near the door. Lena, always 5 steps ahead, had arranged everything. The lights dimmed, a short video played, not of me, but of the company's history. The mistakes, the wasted potential, missed opportunities, masked as confidence. Then one sentence appeared on the screen. Sometimes the person you ignore is building the ground you're about to stand on. A ripple moved through the room. A few gasps. Someone whispered my name. And then I walked in. I didn't say much. I looked at the faces. Some guilty, some hollow, some just confused, and I said, "You gave up on me when I had nothing. Now I own everything you built, and everything you thought I couldn't." The final slide came up. Effective immediately. All former partners are now employees. Titles removed. Salaries adjusted. Welcome to the new order. No applause. Just silence. As I turned to leave, someone near the back asked almost gently, "Why didn't you just shut it down?" I paused at the doorway. Because shutting it down would have ended it. Owning it means they live with it. I stepped into the hallway, and just like that, I left not only the room, but the story they once told about me for good. Some people come back to be welcomed. I came back so they could never rewrite the truth. If this story sat with you, if it reminded you of the rooms you were kept out of, or the names you were told not to say, then maybe you know what it feels like to be quietly erased, and maybe now, like me, you're done staying quiet. Subscribe if you've ever rebuilt yourself in silence. Share this if you know someone who thinks being quiet means being small, and if you've ever been cut out just for being the one who saw things clearly, you're not alone. I never asked to be loved again. I only made sure they'd never forget I was there. They say southern nights are warm. That night, I froze. There were about 40 people in the backyard, faces I recognized from church. Old neighbors from our cul-de-sac, a few second cousins I hadn't seen since Grandma's funeral. String lights hung like stars between the oak trees, dipping low over folding tables covered in gingham cloth and Tupperware salads. Someone was playing soft country music through a Bluetooth speaker. People were laughing politely, passing around paper plates like we were the perfect family from a Sunday insert. I stood near the drink table holding a glass of sweet tea I hadn't touched. The ice had melted. My smile had too. I should have known something was coming. My father had been pacing the edge of the patio all evening like he was waiting for a commercial break in his own life. My mother kept smoothing down her blouse, pretending she wasn't watching him do it. And Mason, well, Mason had that smirk, the one he wore in high school when he'd crashed Mom's car and still got to keep his allowance. Then, like a thunderclap through summer humidity, it happened. "Claire," my father barked loud enough to cut through the music. "It's time you sell that house." The backyard went silent. Not polite silent. Not prayer before dinner silent. Stunned. He kept going, his voice sharp, a little too proud. "Your brother's loan isn't going to pay itself." My fingers tightened around the glass. I didn't say anything. Not yet. I looked to my mother. She didn't flinch, didn't even blink. She just stood there, arms folded, eyes somewhere between bored and complicit, like she'd already written this moment in her head weeks ago. Mason didn't look at me. He was too busy checking his phone, or pretending to. I waited. Maybe he'd laugh and say it was a joke. Maybe someone would step in, Aunt Julie, who always liked me best, but no one moved. No one spoke. They wanted to see if I'd crack, if I'd nod and smile like I always did, if I'd give in, again for the sake of peace. But something in me, something quiet and buried, started to rise. I placed the glass gently on the table. My voice was calm, almost gentle. "Then you'd better start packing." My father blinked. "What?" I looked at him, at both of them. My smile didn't reach my eyes. "You've got 30 days. The air changed, like someone had opened the wrong door and let winter in. A few murmurs began around the yard, questions whispered behind hands. I didn't answer them. I didn't need to, because they didn't know the truth. Not yet, and that was the best part. They said they didn't worry about me. They meant they didn't look for me. I learned early that in our house, fairness was a flexible thing. Mason was the baby, the only boy, the golden child with the dimpled grin and the boundless second chances. When he failed a test, it was the teacher's fault. When I got an A-, Mom asked if I'd studied enough. When he snuck out and crashed his car, sophomore year, Dad said, at least he came home. When I came home 15 minutes late from debate team, I was disrespectful. At 15, I was cooking dinner while Mason played Xbox in the living room. He had favorite meals. I had expectations. When I turned 17, I skipped prom so we could afford my SAT tutoring. Mason got a custom tuxedo for homecoming the same year, even though he dropped out halfway through the semester. And when I got into the University of Georgia on a full academic scholarship, they didn't come to orientation. Mom said gas was expensive that month. But when Mason dropped out of his third college, some tiny entrepreneurial institute in Florida, Dad drove down to help him move back. No one said, "We're proud of you." They said, "You've always figured it out, Claire. You're the stable one." But what they meant was, "You're not the one we lose sleep over, so we don't show up." I didn't throw tantrums. I didn't drink or skip class. I graduated early, got hired 6 weeks out of school, and never asked for help. I kept things moving on time. Under budget, emotionally efficient, I learned to send flowers for Mother's Day. I learned not to expect a card back. When Mason's first business failed a crypto podcast that never made it past episode 3, I helped pay off one of his credit cards, quietly. He never said thank you, just texted, "Got it, you're the best." When Dad had his first back surgery, I took off work, drove them to every appointment, coordinated insurance. At the follow-up, the nurse asked if I was his daughter. He said, "No, this is Claire," as if that clarified things. As if being Claire meant something separate from being his child. But I still hoped, still thought maybe, someday they'd see what I'd built. That quiet doesn't mean cold. That self-sufficiency doesn't mean I don't bleed. So when I bought my house red brick colonial wraparound porch, creaky stairs that felt like home, I sent them a photo. No filters, no caption. Just the place I'd worked 10 years to earn. Dad replied 2 days later. Proud of you. Ever thought of putting it in the family trust? Safer that way. Mom called that evening so far out of town. Baby, are you sure it's safe to live alone? No one asked what color I painted the walls. No one asked how it felt to hold the keys. A week later, Mason showed up unannounced. He walked through the house like he was shopping. You could Airbnb the basement, he said, nodding help with the loan stuff. Our loan, he meant. His latest business imported phone chargers with military-grade tech had imploded again 2 nights. After that, Dad sat me down. Sweetheart, he said, we've always been a family that supports each other. It's time you do your part. Sell this place. Help get your brother back on his feet. I didn't speak, just smiled, and in that silence, something snapped. It didn't break. Not a loud thing, not glass shattering, just a soft, precise crack like the shift in a bone when it sets in the right direction for the first time. I wasn't going to explain myself again. Not for the loan, not for the house, not for the lifetime of being the daughter they counted on, but never truly counted. Let them think I would fold. Let them think I was still playing the part because the next move was already in motion, and this time the paperwork had my name on every line. I let them think I was crumbling. Truth was, I was clearing the ground. I told them I'd think about it. That's all I said. No protest, no tears, no pointed questions about how many times I'd bailed Mason out before. Just a nod, slow and calm, like someone preparing to surrender. And that's exactly what they expected. I could see it in the way. Dad's shoulders relaxed. How Mom offered to send me casseroles just to help with the transition. Mason gave me a half pat on the back like he was doing me a favor accepting my sacrifice. No one noticed my hand tighten around to the edge of the table, or how I pressed my lips together to keep from laughing. They thought I was agreeing to give up everything I built, and in a way, I was. Just not the way they imagined. That weekend, I called my attorney. I'd found her years ago after Mason tried to use my name as a co-signer for a personal loan without telling me. She was sharp, discreet, and didn't ask unnecessary questions. I liked that about her. I need to move the deed into a single-member LLC. I told her, and I want to do it quietly. No public paper trail, she asked, preferably not one they can follow. It took 3 days. I moved the house, the land and the utilities into the name of Clear and Westcott Holdings LLC, a name close enough to throw off anyone skimming but legally mine in full. I made myself both managing member and registered agent. Then I called a property management company, told them I'd be taking an out-of-state contract and needed someone to maintain the house while some family friends stayed for a while. All utilities were rerouted, mail held, the address reclassified under a trust forwarding system. That Monday, I handed over the keys. You can stay here, I said gently, just until I figure out what to do next. Dad clapped me on the back like I'd finally learned something. Mom looked misty, calling it a full circle moment. Mason didn't say much, just parked his BMW in the driveway like he owned it, and I moved into a small rental 15 minutes away. At least, that's what I told them. The house I chose was modest white siding, little garden out front, 2 bedrooms and creaky floors that reminded me of my college dorm. It came with old blinds and low ceilings and not much light, the kind of place people assume is a step down. But the paperwork, that house was mine too. Purchased, months earlier under a different LLC, a different address, a different forwarding agent. Everything clean, separate, invisible. I even had fake lease documents drawn up just in case they decided to snoop. A week later, I invited Mom over for tea, just to finish the scene. She sat stiffly on my sagging sofa, looking around like she was touring a crime scene. Bit of a downgrade, isn't it? She asked, sipping from the chipped mug I gave her. But it's good you're learning to live within your means. I smiled. Yeah, I'm learning all kinds of things. That night, I lit a candle and sat on my own front steps barefoot, letting the wind carry away the last of what used to hurt. They thought I was giving up. They didn't know I was just getting ready. They walked barefoot on what they thought was a gift. It was a fuse. By the second week, they'd made themselves comfortable. Mom replaced the curtains in the living room, said my taste had always leaned too cold. Dad rearranged the den so the recliner faced the window, just like in their old house. Mason brought in his old gaming chair and set it up in what used to be my home office. He laughed while he did it. Said something about reclaiming space. No one asked if I minded. I dropped by once or twice that month, just enough to sell the image. I brought over groceries, some mail they'd forwarded to the house, a six-pack of the craft beer Dad liked. I parked on the street, wore flats, said things like, "I'm managing, don't worry, and it's not forever." They believed every word. Mom started inviting neighbors over for coffee again. At one point, I saw a photo on Facebook, Mason leaning against the front porch, grinning beside a sign that read, "Fresh Start." Claire didn't get tagged. I kept the notifications anyway. There was something oddly satisfying about watching them nest, like watching someone carefully redecorate a hotel room without realizing checkout was already scheduled. The management company handled the paperwork. Quietly, monthly statements were sent to my private business address. I reviewed the tenant agreement again and again, not because I needed to, but because it felt good, concrete legal mine. Some nights I sat at my new kitchen table eating cereal straight from the box laptop open to nothing in particular, listening to the hum of quiet that comes with space no one else thinks they own. I wasn't angry, not anymore. What I felt was sharper, colder, not rage, but readiness, a kind of practiced calm that comes after too many years of being told you were too much or too independent. They thought I was licking my wounds. I was lining up my documents. Then came the invitation. Mason was throwing a party. A small gathering, he said, just family and close friends celebrating a milestone. Apparently the loan was officially paid off. They had managed to handle it. The house had been a sacrifice, Mom said, but one that brought the family together again. The theme was fresh starts. She texted me, "Wear something light. Baby, it's a celebration of new beginnings." I stared at the screen for a long time, then I opened the drawer beside me, pulled out the folder labeled Exit Inside, Deed. Copies, tenant notices, time-stamped signatures. I slipped them into a new envelope, clean and white, and sealed it with a piece of tape. I didn't need to raise my voice. I didn't need to shout. I just needed to wait until the toasts started. They raised their glasses to a lie. I raised the truth. The backyard looked almost identical to the night I left it. Same folding chairs, same string lights, same polite laughter floating beneath the smell of pulled pork and too sweet sangria. But this time I wasn't standing at the edge of the party with a melting drink. I was seated near the center, between the fake fern and the ice bucket like someone they'd allowed back into the circle. Mason was glowing. He wore a pale blue button-down and the expression of a man being slowly crowned. Mom hovered near him like a stage manager, smoothing his collar, fixing his hair. Dad had on his retired but still important face and stood by the grill like he was earning his keep. Sat with a single glass of sparkling water, untouched the condensation slowly soaking into my napkin. I smiled when people passed, nodded when they said, "So proud of your family," said, "Thank you," though no one ever said what for. Near sunset, someone clinked a glass. Dad cleared his throat. "I just want to take a moment to honor what this family has been through," he began. "There were hard choices, but we made them together. Mason, son, you made it. Applause. Light-controlled and Claire," he said, motioning toward me. "Sold her home, her dream to help her brother. That's what family does." More applause. I held my breath for one long beat, then I stood up. My hands didn't shake, my voice didn't rise. "Dad's right," I said. "That is what family does." Silence fell fast, faster than I expected. But what family doesn't do, I continued, is lie. Manipulate and freeload off the one child who actually stood on her own 2 feet. I reached into my bag and pulled out the envelope. White clean, marked only with today's date. Mason shifted. Mom blinked like I'd slapped her. "I didn't sell my house," I said evenly. "I never did." I opened the envelope and pulled out the deed. Then the tenant agreement. Then the notarized notice. I still own that house. This house. It's held under an LLC, which I created, which I control. You're not guests. You're tenants, asps now, chair scraped back. "And as your landlord," I said, holding up the final page, "I'm giving you formal notice to vacate. 30 days, effective immediately." No yelling, no swearing, no breakdown, just faces draining pale under string lights that suddenly felt a little too warm. Someone muttered, "Is this real?" Someone else whispered, "She planned this." I folded the documents, slipped them back into the envelope, sat down. No applause this time, just the sound of Mason breathing too loud, and Dad clenching his jaw like a man who just realized the will he assumed was inherited no longer applies. Mom looked at me, her lips parted, then shut again. She didn't ask why. She didn't need to because she already knew. They all did. They just hadn't thought I'd be the one to say it out loud with documents, not drama, with a deadline, not a cry. They thought I'd come to celebrate a lie. I came to end it. They thought I was burning the house down. I was just turning off the lights. The days after the party passed in a strange quiet. No dramatic phone calls, no midnight doorstep confrontations, just silence, thick, brittle, uncertain. Then one by one, they began to crack. Mason showed up first, not in person. He sent an email written like a newsletter apology. "Hey sis, look, things got a little heated. Maybe we can meet up, talk this through. It's been a rough year for everyone. I'm willing to move out, early if needed. Just don't make this worse than it has to be." I didn't respond. 3 days later, I received a formal complaint from a private lender. Mason had used a shell company to apply for business loans, names borrowed, co-signatures forged. My name came up during a routine flag on addresses, but I'd separated everything. Every LLC, every signature, every paper trail, untouchable. My lawyer forwarded the inquiry, attached a single line. "They'll come for him next." "You're clean, Mom," called that night. She didn't yell. She cried, "Claire, how did it get this far? Your brother is falling apart. Your father won't leave his room. I don't know what to tell people. They're asking questions." I listened, and then I told her the truth. "Tell them I stopped letting you lie about me." She went quiet after that. No more casseroles. No more group texts. No more. "We're proud of our Claire and Christmas cards" I never got. I drove by the house once a week before the notice expired. Dad was on the porch. Head in hands, Mason's car was gone. A small moving truck was parked halfway up the drive, back doors open. It was raining lightly. No one looked up. I kept driving. I wasn't angry anymore. What I felt was peace, cool and clean, like the air after a long storm. 6 months later, I stood in my new kitchen. The ocean beyond the glass was quiet, and the salt air rolled in with the sound of gulls instead of voices. The house wasn't big, but it was mine. Every window, every tile, every silence. It wasn't the kind of place you buy to impress people. It was the kind you keep to be left alone. I started a consulting firm. Quietly built it slow. Hired women like me. Quiet, capable, overlooked. The kind people assume will stay grateful forever. One of them called me a mentor. I changed the subject. Somewhere in that time, an article came out, "Women in Finance Shaping Legacy Through Law." My name was printed in clean serif letters beside a photo. I didn't know they'd taken me mid-laugh hair down, glass of wine in hand. A few days later, Mom sent a message. "We didn't know you'd done so well. The house in the article, is that yours?" No apology. Just surprised that I was never who they thought. I deleted the message. Then I turned off my phone. The thing about being underestimated your whole life is that when you finally rise, they can't follow. They're too busy looking for the girl who stayed behind. But she doesn't live here anymore. I didn't come back for revenge. I didn't come back to be forgiven. I came back so they could never rewrite me out again. I shouldn't have been invited. That was my first thought when I pulled into the circular driveway of the Halloway estate. Same slate stone, same wrought iron gate, same creeping ivy, curling up the columns like it owned the place. It didn't, not anymore. Tessa's voice greeted me before I stepped fully inside. "Mara, you made it. God, you look so Portland." She kissed the air beside my cheek and reached for my coat, pausing just long enough to scan the lapels. My jacket was clean tailored but thrifted. She knew it. I knew she knew. The dining room hadn't changed since the year my father died. Same crystal chandeliers, same oversized silver cutlery that only gets pulled out when there's a press photographer around. None tonight, but old habits. Cousin Brad poured Pinot like he was hosting a tech summit. We just closed a Series B equity valuation in the mid-9 figures, he announced mostly to the ceiling. Tessa nodded along, lifting her glass. "That vineyard in Tuscany I told you about. We're doing private dining now by appointment only. Clients are flown in. Across the room, my mother smoothed her skirt and pretended not to look at me. I sat near the end of the table. My glass was filled with iced tea. Not because I don't drink, because I don't play. Brad leaned back, mock serious. So, Mara, tell us about your little apartment on Alder Street. Still renting? I smiled. I like the space. Tessa tilted her head. Didn't know people our age still rented, but I guess it works for some people. There was laughter. Dry, polite, well-rehearsed. I didn't respond. Not because I didn't have words, because none of them would have landed in that room. What they didn't know, what none of them had ever thought to wonder, was that the Alder Street complex, that was my first acquisition, and this estate, the one they held these legacy dinners in like it was still theirs. I signed the lease renewal 6 weeks ago. The thing is, I wasn't always invisible here. There's a photo buried somewhere in the attic if they haven't thrown it out yet. I'm 9 years old, kneeling in the dirt with my father planting the rose bushes under the south window. We'd gotten matching work gloves at the hardware store. His were too tight. Mine kept slipping. We called that corner the quiet garden. He said it needed something gentle because the house had grown too proud. My father, James Halloway, believed in preservation, not performance. He taught me how to sand wood floors, how to read a mortgage, and how to listen without interrupting. He ran the Halloway estate the way someone might run a summer camp or a public library, orderly but kind. He died in May. Sudden cardiac arrest. I was 22, home from grad school for the weekend. By Christmas, the tone had shifted. My mother remarried a man named Conrad Langley, a banking executive with wine-colored socks and a daughter at Wharton. Conrad moved into the house, and slowly. So did the silence. We stopped having board meetings at the breakfast table. My room was turned into a Pilates studio. The rose bushes were torn out to make space for an herb wall. I remember sitting in the parlor with a folder in my lap, my thesis project, a modular housing initiative designed to protect long-term renters from predatory buyouts. I was proud of it. Still, I pitched it to the family foundation? Tessa laughed before I even finished the first sentence. That's cute. Mara, but scalable how? Brad muttered something about social equity being great for brochures. Mom didn't say anything. She just sipped her tea like she didn't hear me. That night, I folded the folder back into my bag and booked a one-way train to Portland. I didn't leave with bitterness. I left with blueprints. Stone Pine Holdings started with a duplex I bought under a friend's name, then a triplex, then a 12-unit on Alder Street with wood beams and 1940s plumbing. I learned to seal leaks, handle evictions, negotiate tax liens. I built slow, quiet. And I never used the name Halloway, not once, because legacy isn't what you're born into. It's what you build without applause. My first property was a 3-unit brick walk-up on Alder Street, tucked between a shuttered corner store and a Pentecostal church with hand-painted signs. The seller was desperate I was green, but I'd brought a pre-approved loan, a market analysis. I'd written myself and a blank check of nerves. I signed the deed under the name of Cascade Arc, LLC. I'd formed it the week prior, using a registered agent in Salem and a rented P.O. box. No one could trace it back to me. That was the point I moved into. Unit 2A. Refinished the cabinets with my own hands, learned to snake a drain pipe, ate beans for weeks while I covered the roof repair out of pocket. But every month, the rent checks came in on time. Modest, consistent. I'd check the mail, tuck away the envelopes, and whisper, "Thank you." I didn't tell anyone. Not even Isla. Not yet. The next building came 2 years later, a 16-unit complex with vintage ironwork and asbestos problems. I had it cleared under Section 8 preservation zoning, got the tenants rehoused during the process, and brought them back when it was safe. Word spread slowly. Landlords who didn't raise rents, a firm that fixed instead of flipping. Tenants started sending friends my way. Single mothers. Veterans, pensioners clinging to rent-controlled leases. I met Isla at a city council meeting about transit rezoning. She was taking notes for a local tenant group, her blouse stained with ink and stress. She didn't recognize me when she later applied to be my assistant. That was just as well. I hired her, gave her health insurance, and never once mentioned who I used to be. My portfolio grew. Cascade Arc branched into mixed-use buildings, storefront preservation energy retrofits. By 33, I was managing over 110,000 square feet across 5 cities, And all of it, every contract, every LLC, every holding company was carefully layered. I didn't want the Halloway name contaminating any of it. But I still kept a single item from the old estate, a yellowed landscape map hand-sketched by my father. It had been folded into the back of an old ledger I took with me the night I left. At the bottom in his blocky handwriting, "Let the house breathe, or it will forget how to shelter." That map sat on my wall above the desk where I drafted every acquisition proposal. By the time I made an offer on Halloway Plaza, the family estate, now technically under Lien from mismanaged taxes, I already owned 70% of the block surrounding it. They didn't see it coming because people like them never look behind. The next family dinner felt colder even in June. Tessa had on a new pair of Louboutin heels and walked like the floor should thank her. Brad arrived late claiming a client call, but he reeked of vodka and sunscreen. I wore gray slacks and a blouse with no label. Isla had texted me that morning. "Contracts are signed. Holdings at 92% ownership. We're locked in." The estate wasn't just emotionally mine anymore. It was legally mine, and yet I still knocked before entering. Dinner was over. Salted lamb and undercooked risotto, Evelyn. My mother passed out place cards like we were at a benefit gala. She didn't say anything to me. She hadn't since 2015. Halfway through the meal, my Uncle Malcolm cleared his throat. He was head of the estate board now, a title with just enough power to be dangerous. "We've had some correspondence," he began, not looking at anyone in particular. "Stone Pine. Holdings has raised several questions about accounting inconsistencies. There's going to be a financial review. Forks froze mid-air. Stone Pine." Tessa blinked. "Who are they again?" "A private investment firm," Malcolm said tightly. "They've been purchasing legacy properties across the Northwest. We sold them a partial stake a few quarters ago. They've since increased their position," Brad scoffed. "Vultures. They're probably foreign. Want to turn the place into a museum or a condo farm." I sipped my iced tea. Malcolm continued. "They're requesting itemized records for the past 5 years. Renovation invoices, contract bids, foundation expenses." Tessa went pale beneath her spray tan. "That's absurd," she said. "The foundation's private. They bought the plaza." "Tessa?" His voice was harder now. "They own majority rights, including the right to audit." Brad slammed his napkin down. "We're not handing over our financials to some faceless." "They're not asking," Malcolm interrupted. "They're requiring." A silence settled over the table. Thick, pregnant. Across from me, Evelyn cut her lamb in perfect silence, her diamond bracelet tapping the plate. She still hadn't looked at me. "I told you to keep that roofing budget clean," Tessa hissed toward Brad. "I said no bundling." "And I told you not to run the plumbing through your husband's shell company," Brad shot back. "So it's my fault you billed us double for landscaping because I had to clean up your—" "Enough," Malcolm snapped. "This isn't about finger-pointing. This is about Stone Pine, seeing things we didn't disclose." My fork hovered over the plate. I watched them all. Not out of amusement, though. There was some. Not out of vengeance, out of confirmation. This was rot. Quiet, rot, moral laziness that wore pearls and carried legacy invitations. They'd made a kingdom out of inherited capital and thought silence meant safety. But silence in my world was where I planted seeds. The audit documents were already compiled. The legal notices were already filed tomorrow morning. They'd get an invitation one they couldn't ignore to a compliance review session with Stone Pine Holdings. They'd come thinking they could charm a faceless executive, and I would be sitting at the head of the table. The room was quiet when I walked in. They had already gathered Brad, Tessa, Evelyn, Malcolm, 2 estate attorneys, and a Stone Pine Holdings liaison they didn't know was mine. They were seated at the long mahogany table in the estate's old library. My father's library. The chandelier above them had been recently restored. Brass crystal imported wiring. I paid for it, quietly. 3 years ago, no one had asked where the funds came from. No one ever asked. I stepped through the doorway. The click of my heels against the hardwood made Brad look up, then Tessa, then Evelyn. No one said a word. "Sorry I'm late," I said evenly. Traffic on Alder was a nightmare. I set my briefcase down at the head of the table where my father used to sit. where Malcolm had assumed I wouldn't. Brad narrowed his eyes. "What are you doing here? I'm chairing this review," I said, unclipping the latches. Tessa laughed. "Excuse me." I opened the case and began laying out packets of documentation, sliding one in front of each person, like playing cards. "I'm Mara Halloway," I said calmly, "managing partner and sole owner of Stone Pine Holdings. As of this quarter, I control 92% of this estate's equity and 100% of its redevelopment rights." Brad's jaw dropped. "That's not possible. I filed the acquisition through Cascade Arc Holdings. You remember Alder Street, don't you? You joked about me renting it. That was the first building I bought." "You lied." Evelyn finally spoke, her voice razor thin. "No," I said. "You just never asked." Malcolm lifted his packet, flipping pages, his face drained of color. "This can't be real." I turned to Tessa Page, 6. "The invoice your husband submitted for the East Wing plumbing retrofit, $282,000. Average market bid for that scope, $91,000. I've included comparable estimates." She paled. "You went through our contracts. I had a fiduciary duty." "Unlike you." Brad shoved his packet back toward me. This is a stunt." I didn't flinch. Page 9. Covers, the roofing repairs that allegedly required $2,003 million. According to the signed scope, they included materials not even used on this property. Evelyn stood. "You don't get to come back here and humiliate us." I looked at her for the first time. Directly. "You humiliated yourselves." She faltered. I continued, voice still calm. "You told everyone I was poor, that I rented, that I was irrelevant, but I've been the one underwriting your overdrafts for years, quietly without recognition, because I believed stupidly that protecting this estate meant something." Malcolm swallowed. "Why didn't you just tell us? Because telling you would have made it about ego." I said I wanted the work to speak. Tessa's voice cracked. "You want revenge? That's what this is." "No," I said. "If I wanted revenge, I wouldn't be sitting here. I'd be calling the IRS." The room went still. I reached into my folder and pulled out one final sheet, a ledger. This is a list of every anonymous transfer I've made to the Estate Foundation since 2014. Every invoice I've personally covered. Every debt I absorbed to keep this place solvent. Evelyn's hands trembled as she read. I looked at her. "You thought I left, but I was still here. Just not where you could see me." Malcolm cleared his throat, quiet. "What do you want?" "Mara," I considered, then answered, "accountability, structural reform. No more shell contracts, no more nepotism, no more passing legacy off as immunity. This place will be rebuilt from inside out with ethics, transparency, and decency." "And if we say no?" Brad asked. I looked at him, then I released the audit. Silence. Tessa lowered her eyes. Malcolm exhaled. Evelyn sat down slowly. No one objected. I gathered the extra packets and placed them back in my briefcase. As I did, I looked up at the chandelier. "You once called me poor," I said softly. No one moved. I turned to the door. "I paid for that light above your head, and then I left the room." The official board statement was released the next morning. Stone Pine Holdings would assume stewardship of the Halloway estate under a new operating charter, independent audits, ethical contracting, and public reporting of all foundation activities. The existing board would be dissolved. No one contested it. The press picked it up by noon. Former Black Sheep restructures iconic Sonoma legacy. I didn't read the comments. Brad sent a terse email 2 days later. "I withdraw from any future dealings. I expect my privacy to be respected." I didn't respond. Tessa resigned from her public nonprofit roles and pulled her husband's firm from several active projects. A week later, I heard they'd relocated to Austin. Evelyn didn't call. But 3 days after the release, I received a hand-delivered envelope with her handwriting, no note, just a check. The exact amount I had used to save the estate from foreclosure in 2018, I didn't cash it. Instead, I filed it in the Foundation archives under a tab labeled Symbolic Gestures Unclaimed. Malcolm called. He wanted to meet. I agreed. We sat on the same back patio my father used to read on now, repaired, repainted, and shaded with the same lemon tree I planted with him in 1997. He cleared his throat awkwardly. You're more your father than I ever gave you credit for. I didn't respond right away. Then that's the nicest insult I've heard all week. He smiled reluctantly. You know, we thought you left because you were soft. Sensitive. I am. I said I just stopped apologizing for it. He nodded. You built something real without asking anyone for permission. I looked out at the estate's west wing. Quiet, dignified, no longer cloaked in illusion. He built something real, too. I'm just trying to keep it from collapsing. We sat in silence for a few moments, the kind that doesn't need filling. Before he left, he said, You didn't have to come back. I nodded, but I did, because someone had to stay. That evening, I returned to my apartment on Alder Street, the one they all laughed at, the one I still lived in, not because I had to, but because I chose to. Outside my window, an older tenant was sweeping her steps, humming to herself. A teenager in a hoodie waved at me on his bike. The buildings here weren't grand, but they were clean, safe, steady like legacy should be. I changed into a t-shirt-made tee and opened my father's old ledger. Inside the back cover, I wrote a single line. Restoration begins in silence. A week later, I hosted a small gathering in the courtyard of Alder Street. Not a press event. No string quartet, just tenants, neighbors, kids with juice boxes, and one table of cookies. Isla baked herself. The light was soft golden. The kind of California evening that smells faintly of jasmine and pavement still warm from the day I stood near the garden bench, the one I'd restored last spring, using reclaimed cedar and an old sketch my father had drawn. His handwriting was still faintly penciled in under the seat. I hadn't sanded it off. Mrs. Alvarez, who'd lived in Unit 1B for 38 years, settled beside me. She wore a navy cardigan and carried her folding cane like a scepter. Your little party's better than all those foundation galas, she said, smiling. At least the cookies don't come with lectures, I laughed. That's Isla's specialty. Cookies without speeches. She glanced around. It's a good building, you know. Not just the bones, the way it feels, like it's meant for people, not just price tags. I nodded. That was the idea. Down the path, I saw Tessa's daughter 12 now icing a sugar cookie with a plastic knife sitting next to the boy from Unit 3C. I wondered if she knew who I was, if anyone had told her. Maybe not yet. Maybe never. That was fine. Malcolm arrived late. He didn't speak much, but he brought a lemon pie. Said it was a tradition. As the sun dipped lower, I stayed where I was standing in the middle of the space they once said was beneath me. The building was lit from within, not just bulbs and sconces, but warmth, noise, language, community. My phone buzzed. A new message from Isla Tenant. Renewal rates hit 94%. Local business leases extended. Press wants a follow-up. Ignore, I typed back. For now, then, I turned off my phone. This wasn't a story that needed broadcasting. It was enough that it happened, that it held, that it lasted.